the year 2009. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television, and it is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Connie Chung here in New York City.
3, 2, speak.
Well, thank you so much today for joining us. And our first question, we're going to start right from the beginning. What was your name at birth?
Oh, in Chinese, your last name comes first, and Chung is pronounced Zong in Chinese, so it's Zong Yuhua. My given name in Chinese is Yuhua.
What's that mean?
Means like a babbling brook and sky up above, sun, and just kidding. It's people always want a whole story, and the melodious key, the melodious keys of an ivory piano and all that stuff. Nah, I can't remember.
Where were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C. My parents were born in China, and I have 4 older sisters, and they were all born in China. However, in China, my parents actually had 9 children, and 5 of them were lost as babies because it was during the Japanese War and during the beginnings of what became World War II. It was very hard for them to get a doctor if the baby had pneumonia or whatever, so they died as babies. 3 of which were boys, 3 of whom were boys, and 2 girls, and they were left with 4 girls, and the 4 girls and my parents came here, and I was the 10th, and I was born in Washington, D.C. Another girl.
When did you get the name Connie? What did that come about?
Well, my sisters, when my parents called from the hospital and said, it's another girl, and my sister said, okay, we'll name her, because my parents didn't care by then. And so they took an annual movie magazine in which, they probably don't exist anymore, I don't know, but there was a photograph on each page, John Wayne, and whatever, Debbie Reynolds or whatever. So they said the first one we come to will be her name. Thank God it wasn't John Wayne. It was Constance Moore. She was an actress that people don't remember. People remember Constance Bennett. So my name is Constance, and the only person who calls me Constance occasionally is my husband. Constance? But I don't know, it was always Connie.
Now, what brought your family to the United States?
The Japanese War was really horrible. My parents were living in Suzhou, which is Suzhou, in my father's hometown. My mother was from Nanjing. And they're both cities outside of Shanghai. And as the Japanese moved south, my parents left, and my father took his immediate family and his both grandparents, sets of grandparents, and they lived in Sichuan, which is, Sichuan food, hot and spicy. They lived there for a while. And then my father said, I got to get everybody out of here. The grandparents didn't want to go. They went back home. And he worked in Chinese intelligence under Chiang Kai-shek. He finagled a way to leave. And he left, when they left Suzhou, Suzhou is like Venice. There are canals, waterways throughout the city. It's a beautiful city. And he was able to get 2 junks, one for their furniture and one for the family. Big boats. And as they were leaving, and this is during the Japanese War, they got to the Grand Canal safely, but the Japanese dive-bombed and destroyed the one with their furniture. Fortunately, it was that one. Everybody else got out safely. So I just learned about that. Actually, no, my sister had written about it. She wrote an article one time, and I asked, and my oldest sister passed away recently, brain tumor. She's my favorite sister. And she, at her funeral, I I told that story since she had written about it, and I asked my next oldest sister, do you remember that really happening, or did she make it up? And she said, no, it really happened. I remember it. And it was right around the time that Hillary Clinton had talked about Bosnia and getting off the plane and being shot at, you know. And I said, how old were you? And she said, 2.5. Oh, my God. Just like Hillary. So my parents, my father found a way to have himself commissioned as a Chinese Air Force lieutenant colonel. He was going to come to the United States and help train Chinese cadets how to fly. He did not know how to fly, but he was the administrator for this, group of military men. My second oldest sister just told me this, and I was very surprised. I didn't know how he got my family out, how my mother and my 4 sisters. I know that they went to India, and but I didn't know what it was that he told the Chinese that got them visas, or the United States and things like that. And she just told me that, even though this is such a no-no in this current climate, in the sense, I shouldn't put it that way. The bottom line is my parents were brought up Muslim in China, which is very unusual, highly unusual. There were people who followed Confucius and Buddhism and things like that, but there are very few Muslims. What happened was, I think it was just, the missionaries, and both their families were Muslim. And they, my father pretended that they were going to go to Mecca through the United States for the big annual
Hajj.
Yeah, and it was just a guise, because he was this sneaky intelligence officer, and he was able to figure out some way to bring the family. So he sent them to India. My mother had to live there with 4 girls, never been there before. Didn't know how to speak anything but Chinese. And they lived in a hotel for several months until he wired them and said, you're getting on this last ship. She happened to be pregnant with the 9th. I have one sister who thinks that she had a miscarriage, and another sister who thinks that she had an abortion. Because if you had an infant under a certain age, you could not board this ship. It was something like a Swiss ship. It was a neutral country, so it wasn't going to get bombed. And they got on that ship. They got the wire from my father. They got on the ship, arrived at Ellis Island. And when my father came, his last name, which was Tsong, should have been translated to T-S-O-N-G, but in fact it was translated to Chung, which often happens. Like Chang should be Tsang, and it comes out Chang. And so when my sisters arrived and my mother arrived, my father gave himself an English name anyway because he was in intelligence, and he was a big fan. When he was in Shanghai, he was quite the bon vivant, and Shanghai was a very international city, just the way New York is. It was a port city, the way New York is, and so he had already given himself an English name. And since he was a big fan of William Powell, the actor, he decided to call himself William. So his name was William, middle name Ling Chung. And my mother somehow got Margaret. I'm not sure. My sisters, we had a cousin who lived in New York, and his secretary helped name my sisters. There was a Princess Josephine Charlotte visiting at the United States at the time from I don't know where. And so my oldest sister was Josephine, and second sister was Charlotte. And then my third sister was born in June, so she became June. And the fourth sister's, she was the youngest child in the family. And the word for youngest sister is Meme. So she was named Mamie, as in Mamie Eisenhower. So there you go. That's how we got our names.
Oh, so
Sorry, I have to interrupt here.
problem? Oh, is this car
Rustling?
Yeah, it's wrestling.
So when were you born?
I was born in, my parents came from China in 1945. I was born in 46, in August 20th. I'm currently 63.
Now, did your parents acclimate to the U.S. pretty quickly?
My father did, because he already spoke English. He could read and write English. But by the time the communists took over China in 1949, he didn't have a job anymore because the embassy shut down, and that was the end of Chiang Kai-shek's government. So he had to find a new job and a new profession. So what he did, what's the matter?
So you're,
Is it still?
yeah, you're just
No,
caught
I'm
on
just
your
now
knee.
caught.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want me to start over?
Yeah, why don't we start?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I was born on August 20th, 1946. My parents came from China in 1945, and then I was born less than a year later. My sisters were actually quite spread apart. My oldest sister was 16 years older than I was, and she basically was like a second mommy to me, because my mother had such a brood of people to take care of. I think my father became more acclimated to the United States and more quickly acclimated because he could already speak English. He could already read and write English because he had been in the diplomatic service. When the communists took over in 1949, he didn't have a job anymore because the Chinese embassy was closed down in Washington, of course, because Chiang Kai-shek then had to go to Taiwan. So he had to find a new profession. So he used an abacus to add up numbers, not an adding machine. And he said, comes out the same. So he became an accountant. And he had this beautiful abacus, which he could really work. And he'd go click, 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 click. And he would do it really, really quickly. I still have his abacus. It's beautiful. So he became an accountant. He worked for what was then called the GAO, General Accounting Office. Now it's called Government Accountability Office, I believe. He had worked earlier for the UN, an arm of the UN, the Food and Drug Administration, and then he worked for various government agencies, Federal Power Commission, Federal Maritime Administration, and he retired from the government after many years, so he was, he was very much a news buff, and so and a current events and historical events buff, and so I really depended a lot on him for career advice, everything I could think of regarding events. Well, can you tell me about the Lend-Lease Act? Things like that. And then he'd tell me. My mother had a harder time adjusting because she didn't read and write English. She didn't speak English. And she was really interesting. Her father spoiled her. It was both my parents came from very traditional families. Her feet were bound in the beginning, and she complained about it because it hurts, and her father said, okay, you don't have to do that. And she complained about going to school. She was the oldest daughter, and she said, I don't like going to school. So after, I don't know what grade, sometime in elementary school, he said, okay, you don't have to go to school. So she really didn't know how to read and write Chinese either. She could speak Chinese and understand it, of course. But, so she was illiterate. So when she came here, she was so embarrassed that she couldn't either read or write Chinese or read or write English. She had such a hard time. But she was really smart and incredibly efficient. Also in China, they had servants galore. Not that they were terribly wealthy, they were middle class, but people did in those days. They had amas, babysitters, and wet nurses and all of that. And her father was head of a paper factory in his town, and he was kind of like what a mafia head would be, because paper was such a critical product. So the fact that he owned a paper factory was very important. My father's father was a jeweler, and again, middle class-ish, and but servants, cooks, house boys, everything you can think of. So when she came to the United States, my mother found it extremely disconcerting that she had to cook and clean and do all of that. Not that she was a princess, it's just that she didn't do that. And take care of the kids. They always had amas, babysitters, whatever. So, and always bought fresh fruit all the time. And here it had to be once a week on a tiny budget. And she had to figure out how to cook lots of Chinese dishes on a tiny budget. She couldn't write a list to go to the grocery store, so she memorized what she needed. And I would marvel as she went up and down the aisles and just would throw things in the grocery cart and remember. And truly rarely forget. And she concocted a lot of egg dishes and ground beef dishes, which we still make today, because those are her special recipes on an economic budget. I mean, a low budget. So I think that she had a hard time. My sisters did fine. They, went to school, and I mean, they had quite an adjustment. It was hard for the ones who were older because they were 16, 15, and they were teenagers, and they really had to catch up. They didn't speak English. They couldn't write English, read or write, so they had to really put their nose to the grindstone. My parents, I was the only one who was a citizen because I was born here. But my parents, in order to get your citizenship back in those days, you had to cut off communications with all your relatives in a communist country. So that's what they did. And sad as it was, they were unable to write their parents anymore, unable to communicate. So for years, they knew nothing. They didn't know who was alive and who was dead. Finally, I think when I was about 9 or so, everybody in the family got American citizenship. And it was hardest for my mother. And actually, I taught her how to read. I took my kitty books and the books that immigration gave us to practice on, and every day when I get home from school, I would go through it with her. And she couldn't quite get it, but we had a wonderful immigration officer who just passed her. It was just, heart-wrenchingly wonderful because of the rest of the family passed. And so everybody became a citizen. I can't remember what year it was. Something like, 56, 55, something like that. I don't know.
So what kind of kid were you?
I was very, very quiet because, not only because I'm Chinese, which fosters, a lack of being out there, but also because I had 4 older sisters who were screaming Mimis. I could not get a word in edgewise. They thought, my entire family thought that I had, no voice, thoughts, anything, for years and years and years. That we'd go to the soda fountain and they'd say, "Connie, what do you want?" And I just give her a Coke. I mean, I'd be about to say, but honestly, they were just, the girls were way strong. My parents brought up these incredibly strong women. But my mother was really strong. For a little Chinese lady, she had this deep, booming voice, shockingly deep. And especially after her 30s, she started smoking, and it just kept getting deeper. So I really didn't say anything, do anything. I had always wanted to be. I had always wanted to be a ballet dancer. I wanted to take ballet. I had this little book called The First Book of Ballet or something like that, and then Kiki Dances. And I would flip through it day and night. And I'd say, please send me to ballet school. And we didn't have any money. We had no money. So they said, someday, but I would practice the 5 positions. It never happened, so I had to find something else to do.
What kind of student were you?
I was an incredibly diligent student, but I wasn't very good. I mean, I wasn't incredibly smart. I think that Americans, if you will, have a positive. I think Americans have a positive stereotype of what Chinese people are, and they're really smart. They're great with science, math, engineering, and they're studious and the like. And I was diligent, without question, but things did not come easily to me in terms of my subjects and classwork. I think I made good grades. I mean, I have a hard time remembering. I do know I was in the National Junior Honor Society and the Honor Society and the Math Honor Society, but I don't remember why. I remember struggling mightily throughout school.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to the University of Maryland. I went to the University of Maryland, and at the time, it was the cheapest. We did live in the suburbs eventually. We lived in Washington for many years. But then we moved to the suburbs, and since I was in Maryland, if you were an in-state student, you could go to college to the University of Maryland for this much. And then I worked also my way through. So it was the only thing we could afford. It was an average state college, but today the University of Maryland is a spectacular academic college. It has so vastly changed from the time I was there. It's impressive now. It's in the top 10 this, top 10 that. And I flailed around in college. I didn't know what I wanted to major in for years. I mean, I must have switched majors 10 times. I thought I would like a major in biology because I was kind of good at it. But I found working in a laboratory just debilitatingly boring. So I switched many times, different places. I even tried accounting to follow in my father's footsteps, but I just couldn't get it. And finally, the summer between my junior year and senior year, I happened to work as an intern on Capitol Hill for a congressman who was a former newspaper man. He was quite corrupt, and he got out before they got him. However, he got me interested in writing press releases for him and just little things. And I watched reporters come and go and do their thing. So when I went back in the fall, I switched to journalism, although I don't recommend that to young people. They should, I think anybody who wants to go into journalism should major in history, English, political science. Do not major in journalism. I know there are a lot of good journalism schools out there, but forgive me, University of Maryland, but I would say don't do that. You can minor in journalism, but don't major in it.
What attracted you? Saw those people working in the field. What attracted you specifically to it?
Well, it just seemed like an exciting field in that the news changes every day, and even though what you do may follow the same routine, what it is specifically changes every day. It changes with every story. And you can do good. I mean, there's an inherent good in the mission of the fourth estate. I grew up in the 60s, and I never participated in the protests, and because I was such a straight-laced, traditional, goody two-shoes. You know, we grew up in a very, very Chinese home, and you just didn't go out and protest. Although my father did in China. He was really out there. You know, he was very independent, and he participated in demonstrations. But I think that he ruled with an iron fist when it came to his daughters. So when I think that I found it that everyone, all of my peers, were out there at anti-war demonstrations. My friends were leading anti-war demonstrations, you know. So journalism was a great way for me to correct the ills of society, correct the ills of government and the leadership by doing it in a journalistic way. So it seemed like something I could be passionate about, something that I would enjoy something I would enjoy tremendously, because I had always been in student government, and for someone who was so quiet in a little Chinese home, that was my little thing when I was in school, is to get up in front of people and be somewhat of a leader for the homeroom, the class, the whatever. And so at the time that I switched to journalism, newspapers were dying. There was an afternoon newspaper in Washington, D.C. called The Evening Star. Now it's called the Washington Star. And it was an afternoon paper that folded. So there was no more competition in Washington, no competition to the Washington Post. It was later that the Washington Star became, I can't even remember the sequence, but it became a competitive morning paper. So I decided that there was very little future there. At the time that I entered television news, it was the end of the 60s, and television was really relatively new. It was still a baby, and I thought that's the place I should go because it's growing. So that's what I tried.
Now, did you grow up with television? Did you have one in the house?
Well, we didn't have enough money to own a television, but our neighbors across the alley, we lived in a rented house, and there was an alley in back, and the Sarassis, Dr. Sarassi and their 523 children, and Polly and Terry were my sister and my age, the fourth oldest in me. And we used to scoot over there all the time and watch Howdy Doody. And what else did we watch? Oh, we watched like Romper Room, and we watched, there was a Miss Connie on Romper Room, and I always got a kick out of that. She was the teacher. Probably cartoons and things. And then later we finally got a TV. We begged to stay up to watch the Ed Sullivan Show, the Milton Berle Show. The Milton Berle Show, and later the Ed Sullivan Show, and I Love Lucy. Those were our favorites. And if we were good, we could stay up for I Love Lucy in later years. The only trouble we had watching TV was my parents would help out single Chinese people, young Chinese people who were going to school here and left home, and their parents weren't here. And so they used to have them over for dinner. So and these young people would call my parents mommy and daddy because they were just like mommies and daddies to them, a mommy and a daddy to them. So there were these women and men, and a couple of the men, we rented out one of the rooms in our house to them, probably as a gesture of kindness, but also probably to supplement income. And I remember one of them always liked watching Bishop Sheen, And instead of, we wanted to watch Milton Berle. And my parents would say, let Peter watch Bishop Sheen. Oh, God. Why do we have to do this? And so we'd have to toddle off and do homework or something like that. And another one, while my mother was walking my older sister to school, I would be home, and every morning I'd stand at the top of the staircase going, Mommy! And his name was Lionel. He'd go, Mommy is taking Mamie to school. Connie, go back to sleep. Mommy! It was ridiculous. But the memories are great. Of the old house that we had, it was a rented house, and we were convinced, because it was a day of cowboys and Indians, we were convinced that there were Indians in the first floor closet. And you know how you can't go down to the basement because it's like Home Alone? So scary down there. So scary. It was the only place we could roller skate indoors in the winter. And my sister, her job was to iron. The third oldest sister, that's all she ever did was iron. She ironed all day, all night, and she was ironing. She'd go downstairs, turn on the radio, and then since she was down there, we were so excited. We could go down and skate. We'd go around and around, and she'd get them out of here. We played with paper dolls. Do you remember paper dolls? You do? Mm-hmm. We had Mitzi Gaynor paper dolls and Betty Grable paper dolls. We spread them all on the dining room table. And just as we got it all set up, my two meanie older sisters would say, clear the table, it's dinner time. We never had vacations because we didn't have enough money for that. So we'd go to the park a lot, Rock Creek Park, and have picnics. And my parents would give what we called Chinese parties. And there would be always Chinese people who would come to these parties, and we'd dance. So I learned how to ballroom dance when I was like this high. Jitterbug, samba, rumba, all that. We'd go to the library. One of my favorite things was to go to the library. If somebody would take us to the library, because that was the only way we were going to get books to read. My mother would walk me to school every day. Even when I got older and everybody else was walking alone. It was great.
Now, going back to your early career, what did you do after you graduated from college?
The semester before I graduated from college, I had a wonderful professor. By the way, I went to the University of Maryland for 5 years because I couldn't catch up with this new major from just my senior year. Also, I was beginning to tank in my sophomore year because I was going to too many fraternity parties and drinking too much beer. So I needed a fifth year for lots of reasons. And also I worked through. So I went to college for 5 years. The semester before I graduated, one of my journalism professors said, you really ought to try and get a job in February before the June crunch. So I went around to all the TV stations in the Washington, D.C. area and tried to get a 2-night-a-week job. I got a job at WTTG. It was then Metro Media, and now it's Fox. And they gave me a job 2 nights a week as a copy person. And I just ripped wire copy off the machines and just helped anyone, a gopher, anything I could do. In June, the job that opened up was only, for me at the time, we're talking 1969, the only job they would offer me as a young woman or a college graduate female person was newsroom secretary. As much as I didn't want to take it, I went ahead and took it. Because it was a very small newsroom, and I figured I can do a lot of things, and I can learn a lot of things, and I just wanted to get my foot in the door. So I was newsroom secretary, and I would always try and conjure up ways to do other things. So when the news director would be running the news desk or whatever, he'd leave and say, Connie, watch the news desk, listen to the police radios, and get anything, don't miss anything, don't screw up. So there was this one reporter who was really lazy, and I'd call him on the two-way, and I'd say, you have to go out and do this or whatever, and just get the camera crew to shoot some film of it or something. It was for weather, it was pollen count, something, and he said, and I said, well, you come in here and watch the news desk. I'll go do it. So I sent myself out and shot that and came back. And then I wrote it up for the weatherman, and he said, that's really good. And the news director, oh, Connie. So then when a job opened up for the weekday writer for the local anchorman, who was just like Ted Baxter, his name was Alan Smith. Good evening. He'd sit in his office, and this little office, and I could hear him. He's going, good evening. Good evening. Good evening. And so I wanted that job desperately. So the news director said, you just have to replace yourself. I need a newsroom secretary. I need somebody. And right at that time, quite frankly, there was a heavy push to hire minorities and women. So I went across the street to this bank because I would always cash my check with this one particular teller because she was so smart. She was so sharp. And she'd be, hi, Connie, how you doing? And, her name was Tony Taylor, and she was African-American. She was a woman, of course. And I said, Tony, you want to be a star? I'll take you across the street. I'll get you a job at the big TV station. Come on. She came over. She got the job like that, and I became the writer. Several years later, after I was gone, thank goodness, she got all the other African Americans at the station to file a class action lawsuit against the station. Oh my God. I can't remember if they won or what, but I was responsible for Tony. So I was a writer, and I kept pushing to get on the air. So finally, after, I don't know, 9 months or so as a writer or less, it was about a year that I spent before I got on the air, which was terribly short, quite frankly. But they put me on the air. It was a little local station, so I was on the air.
Why did you want to be on the air so badly?
Because I knew that was the progression. I wanted to be a reporter, an on-air reporter. I didn't want to just write for somebody else. I thought if I'm going to write it, I might as well deliver it. So, and get out. You get stuck in the newsroom writing from wire copy. And I wasn't great at writing from information that was already written. I did the classic thing that they say wire services do. It's the Cincinnati rewrite. You just take what the wire copy says and you write it. And so I like the idea of gathering the information and coming up with a lead. And then I could write it so much better. It was because it was original. And coming up with a last line, a nice last line, and create a beginning, middle, and end. It just was so fun. And so if you cover news in Washington, even for a local station, you end up covering national news. I ended up on Capitol Hill. I ended up certainly in city government, but all over Washington. The big stories were happening, and a local station would cover them from time to time. So it was a matter of a year that I was on the air. And honestly, CBS News, Walter Cronkite, that they were looking for, I think, minorities and women. So they hired 4 women in one fell swoop over the early 70s. I was hired in 71, I think. I was hired in 71, but within a few years in that period, Leslie Stahl was hired, Michelle Clark, Sylvia Chase, and me. Michelle Clark was African American. I was Chinese. Leslie Stahl was a a nice Jewish girl with blonde hair, and Sylvia Chase was a shiksa with blonde hair. So there you go. It was 4 permutations and combinations. CBS was done. And that's the way it was for a few years before they hired more women. But the push was so strong at that time. I think I can thank the women's movement for getting me on board.
Did you experience racism earlier at all?
Oh, sure. There are various types of racism that I would experience. Yellow journalism, the news is slanted. It was all colleagues. People wouldn't say that. It was these vicious people. And that happened all the time. And so I would pretty much treat it with humor, instead of becoming as offended as I was. I said to my boss at CBS one time, he said, "Tell him why I hired you." And I said, "Because you like the way I do your shirts." Well, he thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard in his life. I so regret saying that because he kept repeating it. But it was just my way of, I know where you're going. Or I'll get you before you get me, or I get myself before you get me. It's the way it is, or was, all the time, I really believe. Some level of it. But I'll tell you, I had so many things going for me. Like, I was young, a woman, and I was Chinese. When they put me through their normal hazing period, I didn't know which attribute they were aiming at because I think all the women got a lot of grief in the early years. I think all minorities got their share of grief, and I think anyone who was young and inexperienced got their due, which is, we're going to give you grief until you get it right.
How did that manifest itself in terms of your early career?
Well, the people at CBS it was an incredible bureau. It was Roger Mudd on Capitol Hill, Dan Rather at the White House, Daniel Shore at the agencies, Marvin Kalb covering the State Department, Walter Cronkite at the helm. Imagine that. And then the next tier of correspondents were people like Bob Schieffer and George Herman was actually the first tier. They were incredible correspondents, and the kids were Leslie Stahl, Ed Bradley, Bernard Shaw, me. We were the kids who had little kiddie desks in the hallway, and we didn't have our own typewriters. We had to go into the bullpen where the newsroom was to use typewriters. So it was it was very sobering to be a kid growing up in the Washington Bureau, this vaulted bureau, the best bureau in the country. Truly, it was considered to be the best bureau. The Washington Bureau of CBS was considered to be the best bureau, bar none, in the world, at any network. And so I think that everyone, the producers, the camera crews, everybody, just would give us a hard time. You don't know what you're doing. I'm not going to do that. Take orders from you? I don't think so. I'm not taking orders from some silly woman. If someone didn't say it, that was clearly the feeling that I'm going to do what I want to do. You may think that it's your story and that this is what you'd like, this or that or whatever. But that's not going to happen. I'm going to do what I think is right, and you don't know what you're talking about. Or, this copy that you wrote, this lead, is the worst thing I've ever read in my life. The worst. Here. Get it right. Didn't you read what it said in the New York Times this morning? Yeah, but that's not right. No. Whatever. It was just, no, you're not You may have gotten this story, but you're not doing it on the Cronkite News. That you're just a kid. Someday you will. You go do it for radio, and the Star is going to do the story. Just give him all your information. What? But I developed it all. What's your problem?
Did you ever want to call it quits and just say, this isn't for me?
No, I don't know. I persevered. I don't know why. Or go try and get a comment from Ethel Kennedy when she visits Senator Kennedy's grave. What? You want me on the anniversary of his death to try and get her comment from her? Yes. Or go cover Pat Nixon.
Well, did you?
You know what? I think I went as they asked with the crew, but I don't think I ever tried. It's just beyond rude. They would say, go cover Pat Nixon. She's giving the... go cover Pat Nixon. She's presenting the Golden Pig Award or something. You know what I mean? And I'd say, that is not going to make the news, Why are we even covering it? It was very protective. They did protective coverage, just in case something happened. And Ed Bradley would go up to the assignment editor and say no to things like that. And all the men would go up and say, you're crazy. I am not going. And then they'd ask the women, or tell the women, and we'd go, okay. It was horrible. But so we did our duty. We put our time in. One time I was supposed to follow H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's aide, to church during Watergate. One time I had to follow H.R. Haldeman to church during Watergate. And I said, oh, no, don't have me do that. Go. It was on a Sunday. I worked on weekends. That's another thing. Go. And so I did. But what I did was, at his house before he left, I said, look, I've been asked by the mean old assignment editor to interview you. And I apologize, in advance. And he just said, and as they were getting out of their car and walking to the church, I approached them, and the wife gave me this eviscerating look, and oh God, it was horrible. But Haldeman, oddly enough, when we followed them back to the house again, he said, okay, I'll stand here. And he said, so that I could get something. Bless him. He said, no comment, no comment, no comment, no comment, no comment. But he stood there. And thank goodness. He took pity on me, because I told him, I don't want to do this.
Now, is there a point where you felt like you'd broken out, that you'd gone through your hazing, and you started to get the stories that you wanted to do?
Oddly, there was a time when I thought I had finally kind of made it at CBS. I was covering on the campaign trail. I covered George McGovern in the 72 campaign, and then I covered Watergate, and then I covered Nelson Rockefeller when he was named vice president under Gerald Ford when Nixon had to resign. And I think there was a seminal moment in my career. I think it was on the McGovern campaign at some point in 1972. I'm not sure, but I do remember thinking that I think I have reached some level of competence in their minds, meaning the suits, in their minds, and some level of that I had made it to in their minds. And I think that's very hard to embrace. honestly, for a lot of women, because they continue to strive and cannot declare success and say, I've made it. I think men have a different approach. Once they feel successful, I think they say it. And I don't think women do.
Now, you mentioned covering McGovern. What exactly were you doing? Were you actually on the trail with him the entire time? Or?
Yes. In those days, networks covered candidates wall to wall. And he was the Democratic presidential candidates running against President Richard Nixon. So we were with them, with the candidate and his entourage, day and night. So we'd be up early in the morning, get on what was called the zoo plane, which is the reporter plane, and just followed him from pit stop to pit stop until he finally went to bed at night, and we could go to bed. And I basically covered it for radio, for CBS Radio. They had stars covering McGovern for TV, for Walter Cronkite, for the CBS Morning News, and I was basically covering for radio. Or I was standing there holding the mic or keeping the place warm until the star came, whoever it was.
At what point did you start seeing yourself have actual national camera time?
Well, actually, the first story that the first week I was working at CBS, I did get on the Walter Cronkite News, and it was on the Friday. I started on a Monday, and I got on Friday. I think I started on a Monday. I may not have, because I know I had weekend duty. Anyway, it was in the first week that I first started working for the CBS Evening News and CBS, and they had me cover a hearing on Capitol Hill, and they didn't expect it to make news, and it did. So they said, you're going to be on, and it was my first time on national news. It was quite momentous, I can tell you. But I was not on very often. At that time, those of us who were reporters were classified as called reporters, and only when we sort of made it did they call us correspondents. So it might have been then that I felt I had finally made it at CBS. But I also remember that early on, I had a base salary of something like $26,000 a year, but I could make more if I did a $35 TV spot or a $25 radio spot. So I churned those radio spots out because I needed the money, the income. And I think I could bring it up to $27,000, $28,000, sometimes $29,000 if I had a really good run with Cronkite stories.
Did you have a chance to work with Cronkite? Or?
Yes. Oh, yes. He was in New York, of course, but we were in Washington. But he'd come down and anchor the news from Washington often, and we'd talk on the phone. Sure, I knew Uncle Walter very well. He was, it was unmistakable when he would call. Connie, this is, and he doesn't even have to say, this is Walter. But we had a wonderfully endearing relationship. He was always respectful and never chauvinistic, whereas a lot of men in those days were, who were in the business. He was not. He was avuncular. He was fatherly, uncle-ish. He always had good advice. And one time he asked that I put together what we'd call think piece on Nelson Rockefeller when I was covering him as vice president. And I worked on it pretty hard. And then when I aired it, he called me up afterwards and he said, "You did a good job, Connie." It was just marvelous. And then when I got the anchor job of filling half of his seat many years later, in 1993, he called me up and he gave me one bit of advice. And he said, just remember, just remember to be yourself. And that's what he was. Walter was himself. And I took it to heart. He was right.
Now, in those early years, were you starting to gain some bit of fame as well?
I don't know if I was gaining fame, but since I was the only Chinese person on national television, I think that if anybody was watching the news, I just didn't look like anybody else. I didn't look like everybody else. So it may be that registered with some people, because people have told me, my grandfather used to watch you in the 1970s. So.
Did you get a lot of response from Asian Americans as well?
Yes. Although I have to tell you, not until later. Later, Asians of all countries, but also just women in general, have said, I used to watch you.
Now, actually, let's stop here and change the